Now when I get a new knife like this that I haven't used before, and I'm going into an area like that for the first time, I relax completely, don't think about the knife, don't think about technique, let everything come to me naturally and see what happens. And I found that I was constantly shifting my grip like this, putting my thumb up on the ramp. Then I'd go back to using a traditional hammer grip, and then as soon as I stopped thinking about it and focused on the wood and moving around, I'd instinctively go back like this again. Which is kind of puzzling because this is really uncomfortable. If you chop into anything hard and the tip rings up, all the shock comes right back on your thumb. Your thumb is not very strong in regard to the main joint. Secondly, the thumb pad is right against this jiggery thing here, so that gets uncomfortable. However, what I found was it's not nearly as uncomfortable as doing this, because again, my index finger was the only thing allowing retention on the blade, and it was constantly ramping up, and I'd do a chop and my index finger would shift up a little bit, and then it would be on the point, and then the next chop I'd whang right into the wood with my index finger on the point. Not comfortable. What I found was when I did this instinctively, you can see how my thumb is ahead of my index finger. And that little thing creates sort of a counter torque and leverage which stabilizes it, and that keeps my index finger locked. With my thumb on top of it, there's no sort of counter torque and they both just wiggle around each other. The same thing doesn't happen here. It stabilizes it in hand. So when I was doing really light cutting and I could pop off the branches relatively easy, this was a nice effective grip. The cutting force was really low, so there was no real amount of force being generated back to me when I was cutting through the limbs. But as soon as I went through the harder limbs, wham! And especially if the knife wouldn't cut all the way through and would bring up solid, painful. So I had to switch back to doing this. Now this is not nice because again my index finger would slowly drift down, do a cut, my index finger would be up here a little bit, whang, the next one would not be nice. So I was constantly focusing on shifting my grip, shifting my grip. The other thing is this knife is really light and really neutrally balanced, which means it has almost no inertial moment. What that means basically is when a knife goes to cut into something, it's stopped very easily because it doesn't have a lot of momentum when it's rotating, or straightforward linear momentum, because again it's very light and very neutrally balanced. And because of that, when you chop in the normal sort of region, which is try to impact sort of down around here, which is where you would do with say something like the hungless, the blade just feels very light, awkward, doesn't cut very well at all, and you're getting a lot of shock and movement in your grip. Anyway, I noticed, however, when I shifted way up and started cutting way out on the tip and moving the knife as fast as possible, doing very fast snap rotation cuts like this, the performance jumped up dramatically, and it wasn't the same knife at all. Because the knife is so light and you don't have very much momentum, you can't chop slowly and heavily. It just doesn't work. The knife does not perform well. But if you use a lot of rotational speed, snap the knife around, and concentrate your chopping out through the tip, it starts to become decently functional. Now again, I'm talking about as compared to chopping down here. It doesn't nearly approach the level of, say, the Cold Steel Kukri machete, but I'm just saying, comparing the tip cutting, which is very, very fast, very much a rotational sort of chop, to cutting down by where the actual hoodlum writing is, there on the blade, and trying to do more almost sort of up and down sort of axe-like movements like this, they're not at all comparable. So, couple of initial comments just after this little bit of work. This index finger cutout and a very slick grip are a bit problematic. Two of those things do not want to be together, for reasons which I've noted before. In terms of general chopping ability, you notice a huge difference when you're using this compared to any of the sort of short machetes or heavier blades, and it's a many to one sort of functional type deal. Again, slow, sort of deliberate cuts where you're trying to use a lot of sort of power and force don't work. The blade doesn't have the mass or the heft to make that functional. Instead, you got to take this and snap it around fast, and you got to use the tip. I was a bit concerned about how thin the tip was, so I tried a couple of relatively light tasks, which would be snapping off some of the harder boughs which are cooked right in by the tree, which are hard to get out, so you just put the point in behind them and pop them out like that. That worked fine. I also pried off some of the very, very thick spruce bark, which might sound a bit funny trying to pry off bark, but it can be a bit demanding for some knives, and you can see there's residue on the tip. I worked well on that. However, I also tried, there was an old stump in there, and that was sort of in a decent semi sort of rotted state. I would not trust the tip to do any type of work on that. It's just way too thin. I took the Kukri machete from Cold Steel, chopped that in, had no problem sort of breaking it apart by a combination of chopping it in and sort of rotating the blade, prying it apart, no problem. But when I did that with the Hoodlum and I turned the Hoodlum, the tip sort of turned and the wood really didn't do anything. So in terms of prying or digging in woods, I think the tip on this is going to go really, really fast. I'm also concerned about just impacts on the tip. If you're trying to split wood or do any kind of sort of impact cutting with it,